In September of 2009, a man named Gerald Pruitt walked through the double doors of the Kessler Auction House on the main square of Harlan County, Kentucky, carrying a dented metal toolbox with a broken latch held shut by a loop of baling wire. He had driven 40 minutes on a Saturday morning because his late father's estate was being dispersed that day, and the auctioneer, a man named Dennis Vance, had told him over the phone that odds and ends from a watchmaker's shop would draw maybe $400 on a good day, probably less. Gerald had not argued. He did not know much about watches. The room was half full. There were antique dealers from Harlan and Middlesboro, a couple of pickers who worked estate sales for resale margin, and one man in the back row who had driven 3 hours and 17 minutes from Lexington that morning for no reason anyone in that room could have explained. His name was Earl Mott, and he was 61 years old, and he had spent 37 years repairing clocks and watches in a shop the size of a small bedroom on the second floor of an office building on Vine Street. He did not say much. He sat with his hands on his knees and waited. The toolbox sold for $412. A dealer named Phil Akers bought it, loaded it in his truck, and drove home to sort through it. What he found inside made him call his contact in Cincinnati. What his contact in Cincinnati said made Phil Akers call Gerald Pruitt and offer him $800 to buy it back. Gerald said he would think about it. He called Earl Mott instead. 18 months later, in March of 2011, at a room inside the Kentucky Heritage Museum of Crafts in Berea, a senior horologist from the Smithsonian Institution named Dr. Alma Reyes stood in front of that open toolbox and did not say anything for almost 2 full minutes. Then she said very quietly, "Where has this been?" That question turned out to have a very long answer. This is the story of it. Let me tell you about Olin Pruitt first, because without Olin, none of the rest of it makes any sense. Olin Pruitt was born in 1931 in the coal seam country of Harlan County, the youngest of 4 children in a household where the father worked underground and the mother kept a kitchen garden and a flock of laying hens. He was the kind of boy who could not leave a broken thing alone. By the time he was 11, he had taken apart and reassembled every clock in the house, including the wind-up alarm his mother kept on her nightstand, which ran 3 minutes fast afterward, which his mother considered an improvement. His father found him a job sweeping up in a dry goods store owned by a man named Clyde Sparks, and Clyde Sparks happened to repair watches as a side trade, doing small maintenance work for miners and their families. Olin watched. Clyde told him to stay away from the equipment. Olin stayed close and watched anyway. By 1947, Olin had taught himself to clean and regulate a pocket watch movement, well enough that Clyde Sparks was letting him handle the simple jobs. By 1951, when he came back from Korea, Clyde Sparks was dead and the dry goods store had closed, and Olin had a discharge check and a very specific set of skills that exactly nobody in Harlan County was paying for. He opened a repair bench in the back of his brother-in-law's hardware store in 1952. He charged 60 cents to clean a movement and $1.25 to replace a mainspring. He was known for 2 things: that he could fix watches other people had given up on, and that he never once told a customer their watch was not worth fixing. There is a certain kind of knowledge that does not announce itself. Olin Pruitt never joined a guild. He never attended a horological convention. He did not subscribe to the trade publications that would have told him, had he subscribed, what the established view was on the problems he was solving. What he did was sit at that bench for 42 years, cleaning and repairing movements that came to him from across 4 counties, and over those 42 years he accumulated something that cannot be quantified by professional appraisers standing in a hallway. He accumulated a collection of tools he had either made himself or purchased from craftsmen he knew personally, a set of material acquired across decades through channels that had long since closed, and a handwritten body of notes occupying 14 ledger books that recorded every movement he had ever worked on, the problems he encountered, the solutions he reached, and the measurements he had confirmed or discovered along the way. Let me tell you what those ledger books actually contained, because the description does not carry the weight of the thing. The watchmaking at the repair level involves a set of tolerances so small that the difference between a movement running within acceptable variation and a movement failing within a year can be a question of which lubricant was used, in what quantity, at what ambient temperature. The manufacturers who produced the great American railroad-grade pocket watch movements between 1880 and 1940 specified their own lubricants and their own service intervals, and those specifications were correct for the conditions in which the watches had been designed and tested. What the specifications did not account for was the variation in conditions across a continent, across a century, across the specific demands of a particular working population. A pocket watch carried by a coal miner in Harlan County in 1955 lived in conditions that the watch's designer in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in 1910 had not precisely imagined. It saw temperature swings, dust, intermittent winding patterns, and physical shock that were different in character from what the service manual assumed. Olin Pruitt figured this out over time, not by reading the literature, which he had only intermittently and incompletely, but by observing what failed and when and under what conditions. He kept notes. He adjusted his methods and noted the adjustments. He recorded when a manufacturer's recommended oil degraded faster than it should have in the summer heat of the hardware store, and what viscosity he had substituted, and how the movement performed afterward. He drew small, precise diagrams in the margins of the ledgers, with measurements noted in fractions of a millimeter, indicating the tool modifications he had made to reach particular parts on particular calibers. He noted the specific failure patterns of the Hamilton 950, the Elgin Father Time, and the Illinois Bun Special when they came in from men who had carried them underground for 20 years. He was not writing a technical paper. He was keeping track. When Olin retired in 1994 at 63 with bad eyes and worse knees, he packed all of it into that dented metal toolbox and put it in the back of his closet. His son Gerald was a foreman at a gravel operation in Bell County and had no interest in watches. His daughter Rita had moved to Indianapolis in 1988. Neither of them knew what to do with it, and neither of them knew enough to know that not knowing was a problem. Dennis Vance, the auctioneer, was not a bad man. He had run a competent operation for 20 years, and he knew antique furniture and farm equipment and estate jewelry well enough to call values within 15%. He did not know horology. When he looked at the Pruitt toolbox, he saw a battered metal container holding a collection of small implements, a few old tins and boxes of what appeared to be miscellaneous parts, and a stack of water-spotted ledger books that looked like accounting records from a defunct small business. He appraised the lot at $300 to $500. He was doing his job. Phil Akers did not know horology either, but he knew enough to know that some of the small tools in the box were unusual. It was his Cincinnati contact, a dealer in antique scientific instruments, who told him that one of the implements in the box appeared to be a watchmaker's staking set manufactured by the American Watch Tool Company in Waltham, Massachusetts, sometime before 1910, in a condition that would have drawn attention under any circumstances. That was the phone call that made Phil Akers offer Gerald Pruitt $800. He was hoping to make a modest profit. He did not yet understand the scale of what he was looking at. Gerald Pruitt made the better call. Earl Mott had been reading about the Pruitt estate in the community notices section of the Harlan paper for reasons that had more to do with professional habit than any specific expectation. He had not known Olin Pruitt personally, though he had heard the name through the diffuse network of serious repairers who occasionally corresponded through letters and phone calls, and, by 2009, through the early forums where people of that trade found each other. What he knew was that a Harlan County watchmaker who had worked from the early 1950s through the mid-1990s and had never sold off his bench inventory might have accumulated things that were no longer easily found. He drove to Harlan that Saturday, not entirely sure why. He arrived after the box had sold. Gerald Pruitt had his phone number by the following Tuesday. Let me tell you about what was in that toolbox, because this is where the two kinds of knowledge split apart. What Dennis Vance had seen was disorganized old equipment. What Earl Mott saw when he opened the box on Gerald's kitchen table 2 weeks after the auction was a working vocabulary. The staking set was there, as the Cincinnati dealer had identified, and it was in a condition that Earl described afterward as embarrassing to look at directly, because nothing that fine ought to have been sitting in a closet for 15 years. But that was not the most important thing. The most important thing was the material in the 14 ledger books, which Gerald Pruitt had considered to be old accounting records and which were in fact something far more specific. Olin Pruitt had kept in a cramped and consistent hand across 4 decades a running record of every unusual movement he had encountered. He had noted serial numbers and caliber identifications wherever he could locate them. The specific problems associated with each movement's design, the tolerances he had discovered by working the piece rather than by consulting a reference, the tool modifications he had fabricated to reach parts that the standard tools could not reach, and the methods he had worked out on his own for problems that the trade literature he did have access to had not addressed. He had recorded oil viscosities by season and by the conditions of Harlan County specifically. He had noted every instance where a manufacturer's recommended method had failed him and what he had done instead. He had drawn careful pencil diagrams in the margins, with measurements noted in fractions of a millimeter. Earl Mott sat at Gerald Pruitt's kitchen table for 4 hours that afternoon. He read slowly. He turned pages carefully. Gerald made a pot of coffee and a second pot, and eventually put a plate of crackers on the table, and Earl did not acknowledge any of it. When Earl finally looked up, he said, "Your father solved 3 problems in here that I have seen published nowhere." Gerald did not know what that meant. Earl explained that the ledgers contained descriptions of diagnostic methods and repair approaches for specific movement types that were, to his knowledge, either unknown to the current trade or known only in fragmented form through oral transmission from repairer to repairer, subject to the degradation that attends anything transmitted only by word of mouth across generations. The knowledge was not famous because Olin Pruitt had not been famous. It was not published because Olin had not published. It existed in those books because Olin had written down what he learned, the way meticulous people who do not trust their own memory always write down what they learn. This is what Dennis Vance had called accounting records. This is what Phil Akers had assumed to be the least valuable part of the lot. Now, while all of this was unfolding quietly in Gerald Pruitt's kitchen, something else was happening 50 miles away in the shop of a man named Russell Gant. Russell was Gerald Pruitt's age, mid-50s, and he had inherited a small watchmaking and jewelry repair operation from his uncle in Williamsburg, Kentucky. He was a reasonable technician, careful and thorough, within the limits of his training. When the digital training programs from the major Swiss repair organizations had become available in the early 2000s, Russell had enrolled and certified. He had invested in the equipment those programs specified. He purchased a modern ultrasonic cleaning unit, a new oiling station with synthetic lubricants formulated to current specifications, and a set of high-carbon staking punches from a German supplier that cost him nearly $1,400 and were the pride of his bench. He talked to the suppliers. He followed the updated protocols. His work was technically correct by every current standard he had access to, and the common service jobs moved through his shop at a pace that earned him a reasonable living. What Russell could not do was the unusual work. Not the standard service calls, which he handled efficiently and well, but the pieces that came in from serious collectors, the pre-war Swiss calibers, with their particular quirks, the American railroad grades with their idiosyncratic regulator systems, the English fusee work that occasionally came off a shelf somewhere in the mountains after a family had held it undisturbed for 70 years. On those pieces, he occasionally made choices that were technically defensible by current standards, but historically wrong for the specific movement, because the knowledge he had was current and his reference library was recent, and the knowledge required to make those decisions correctly was older than any source he owned. He was doing exactly what his training told him to do, and his training simply did not reach far enough back. He was not careless. He was a good technician operating at the edge of what his knowledge covered. The comparison would matter later, when the field itself began to reckon with what Olin Pruitt had found. Earl Mott left Gerald's kitchen that afternoon with a handshake agreement and a specific proposal. He would catalog the ledger books systematically, cross-referencing Olin's notations against the existing trade literature he had access to, documenting the instances where Olin's findings diverged from published methods and where that divergence appeared to represent genuine, independent discovery. He would not buy anything. He would help Gerald understand what was there. In exchange, he asked only to be permitted to copy whatever was relevant to his own practice. Gerald agreed to this without fully understanding what he was agreeing to, which was a characteristic of Gerald Pruitt that would serve him well in what was coming. It took Earl 14 months. He worked in his shop on Vine Street in Lexington during the days, repairing what came through the door, and he worked on the Pruitt catalog on evenings and weekends, reading each ledger entry against his reference library, noting the pages where Olin's notation pointed somewhere the literature did not go. He was 62 and 63 during those months. He had reading glasses that he pushed up his nose repeatedly, and he drank too much coffee, and he did not tell anyone what he was doing because he was not sure yet what it amounted to. Some evenings he sat with a ledger open and one of his reference texts open beside it and compared them for an hour without writing anything down, because what he was looking at required the kind of patience that writing slows down. Those were the evenings he found himself thinking about Olin Pruitt most directly, not as a name attached to a collection, but as a man who had sat alone at a bench in a hardware store in Harlan County and worked something out, year by year, without anyone to confirm whether he was right, and then written it down anyway, in that cramped, consistent hand, for no audience except himself. By the winter of 2010, he was sure. He called a colleague at the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors, a man named Harvey Blum who served on the Technical Publications Committee. He described what he had found in careful, measured terms. Harvey was quiet for a moment and then said he would like to see the documentation. Harvey Blum called Dr. Alma Reyes at the Smithsonian in January of 2011. Dr. Reyes was 49 years old, with a doctorate from the University of Delaware and a specialty in American horology, specifically the period from 1860 through 1930, when American watch manufacturing had achieved a technical standardization that was, in certain respects, more advanced than what the Swiss industry was producing at the same moment. She was the person you called when you needed to know whether something was what it appeared to be, because she had spent 20 years developing the standard by which appearances were assessed. She was not easily impressed. She had been shown many things that people believed to be singular, and had confirmed only a fraction of them. She was the qualified outside judge for this particular question. She drove to Berea in late February 2011 to the meeting room at the Kentucky Heritage Museum that Harvey Blum had arranged, where Gerald Pruitt and Earl Mott were waiting with the toolbox and the ledgers spread across two folding tables. She looked at the staking set first. She did not touch it for several minutes. She asked Earl how it had been stored, and Earl told her what he knew. She made a note. She looked at the other tool items Earl had flagged during cataloging, working through them one by one with the unhurried attention of someone who has learned that speed is the enemy of accuracy in her particular kind of work. Then she began reading the ledgers. She did not read quickly. She read the way people read when the words are not quite cooperating with their expectations, when they have to slow down and re-examine what they thought they understood. Earl recognized the expression because he had worn it himself across 14 months of evening work. Gerald sat across the table and watched the two of them and did not say anything. The 2 full minutes of silence after she closed the last ledger were the loudest 2 minutes Gerald Pruitt said he had ever sat through. Then she said, "Where has this been?" She was not asking where it had physically been, though the closet in Harlan County was the literal answer. She was asking how knowledge of this specificity, documented with this degree of care, had existed in the material record for 4 decades without anyone in the professional field knowing it was there. The answer, which she already understood and which Earl had already understood, was the same answer it always turns out to be. It had been there all along. It had been in a small town in coal country, worked out by a self-taught man at a repair bench in the back of a hardware store, and it had never been submitted for publication because Olin Pruitt did not think of himself as the sort of man whose findings got published. He was the sort of man who wrote things down so he would not forget them. He had been right about every other thing. He had also been right about the writing down. Then came the summer of 2011, and what it brought. If you spend any time around the people who repair old mechanical watches seriously, you find that the field is dividing itself quietly in a way that does not make the trade press, but that every working repairer can feel. Common quartz repairs have become inexpensive and commoditized. Modern mechanical production, the current output of the Swiss and Japanese industries, is handled by certified factory-authorized service centers with proprietary tooling and standardized protocols. That leaves a third category: the pre-war American railroad grades, the complicated pocket watches from defunct factories, the antique English and French movements that have been in someone's family for 100 years. And it is this category where the certified modern training does not reach, and where the knowledge that matters most is the oldest and the hardest to find. In the summer of 2011, a collectors association in Atlanta organized a symposium specifically on the pre-war American railroad grade movement, centered on the Hamilton 992 and 950 variants produced in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, between 1912 and 1940. These were movements that had survived in large numbers and were actively collected and serviced, and they presented specific restoration challenges that the modern training curricula did not fully address. The symposium was looking for technical presenters who had actual bench experience with these movements, rather than academic familiarity. Harvey Blum submitted Earl Mott's name in April. Earl agreed reluctantly. He had not presented publicly since 1997. He presented 3 of Olin Pruitt's diagnostic methods. He credited Olin Pruitt by name and by county and by the dates the notations had been made. He presented the deviations from established practice as findings from the field, the kind of empirical discovery available only to a practitioner who had worked the same bench for 40 years, encountering the same failure modes in the same regional conditions, with the same patient attention to what actually happened, rather than what the manual said should happen. The room was mixed. There were serious collectors, a few dealers, certified technicians from factory-authorized service centers, and 2 members of the technical publication staff of the Watch and Clock Bulletin. 3 people were impatient and said so. The majority listened. One man in the front row, a certified master watchmaker from Atlanta named Theo Crane, who held a diploma from the Swiss WOSTEP program and had been servicing Hamilton railroad grades for 22 years, sat very still through the entire presentation. At the end, he asked Earl one question. "Have you tested the oil viscosity recommendations against a digital timegrapher?" Earl said he had. He read the results. Theo Crane did not say anything else for a while. He looked at the printed page in his hand, and then he looked at the table, and then he looked back at Earl. "We have been overcorrecting," he said quietly. "On the 950. We have been overcorrecting for 8 years." That was the recalibration Olin Pruitt would never know he had triggered. He had died in February of 2008, 14 months before his son walked that toolbox through the doors of the Kessler auction house. He had not known, and could not have known, that the methods he had worked out on his bench in Harlan County in the 1970s and 1980s were going to be cited in a hotel conference room in Atlanta in 2011 and would change what a certified expert with 22 years of experience did in his shop the following Monday morning. He had written them down for himself, for his own memory and his own practice. That was all. Earl drove home from Atlanta and sat in his shop for a day before he called Gerald. The conversation was about numbers at that point because it had to be. The tools in the Pruitt toolbox had been assessed during Earl's cataloging work by a specialist appraiser, a woman named Carol Denby in Cincinnati, who had 22 years of experience specifically in vintage watchmaking equipment. Carol's assessment was methodical and took 3 weeks. The staking set had been manufactured by the American Watch Tool Company prior to 1908 and was in a state of preservation she rated as exceptional, which was a word she used rarely. There were 7 additional tool items in the box she rated as significant. There were parts and material in the small tins, some of which dated to the 1940s and earlier, that were no longer commercially available in those specifications. Carol Denby's written assessment was 18 pages. Her final figure for the entire toolbox contents, tools, material, and the 14 ledger books together was not $412. It was not even $4,000. Carol Denby's assessed value for the complete Pruitt toolbox was $67,400. Gerald Pruitt read that number twice. He was sitting at his kitchen table, in the same chair where Earl Mott had sat 14 months before, and the number was on a page of Carol Denby's report that Earl had driven to Harlan to deliver in person, because he had thought this was not the kind of thing you mailed. Gerald read it, and he looked up, and Earl was watching him from across the table. "Dad never charged more than $15 for an overhaul," Gerald said. "No," Earl said. "He didn't." That number landed the way those numbers always land. Not with noise, but with a settling. as though the ground had quietly shifted 1 degree and the whole landscape had rearranged itself around a new level. $67,000 in assessed value for a toolbox that had sold for $412, sitting in a closet for 15 years, representing 42 years of accumulated practice by a man who had never once described himself as anything other than a watchmaker in Harlan County. The story, after that, moved in the direction those stories always move. Gerald Pruitt declined Phil Akers' follow-up offer and a later offer from a collector in Ohio who had heard about the assessment through the collector network, and an inquiry from a broker in New York who called in November of 2011. He was not interested in selling. He was interested in figuring out what to do with something that he now understood mattered to people who could explain why. Earl Mott wrote up the 3 diagnostic methods for the Watch and Clock Bulletin under his own name and Olin Pruitt's, and they were published in the spring 2012 issue. The editorial note identified Olin as a self-taught practitioner working in Harlan County, Kentucky, from 1952 to 1994. The piece drew more correspondence than any technical article in that issue, most of it from repairers who said they had encountered the same problems and had not known there was a documented solution. Theo Crane in Atlanta recorrected his lubrication protocol for the Hamilton 950 and wrote a short note to the bulletin that winter acknowledging the source of the correction. He was not required to do this. He did it because he was a careful person and because he believed the record should reflect where knowledge came from. He also, in that same note, wrote that he had been working on these movements for more than 2 decades and that the discovery reminded him that the distance between what the literature covers and what the practice requires is larger than any of us working in the field tend to assume. Russell Gant, in Williamsburg, read the bulletin piece in the spring of 2012 and recognized 3 of the movement types Olin had documented because they were types that had come through his own bench in the preceding decade. He called the number listed for Earl Mott. He drove to Lexington in May and spent a full day with the copied ledger pages, asking questions. Earl answered them. At the end of the day, Russell said that 2 of the approaches Olin had documented were things he had been doing incorrectly, not because he was careless, but because his training had not reached back far enough into the material reality of those specific movements, and he had not known there was a record that did. He shook Earl's hand. He drove home. He retooled 2 of his standard procedures. If you are wondering whether that difference mattered to the people whose watches Russell serviced, the answer is yes. It mattered in the way that fractions of a millimeter matter to a movement designed to keep time within a few seconds a day. The watches Russell had serviced on the old protocol had not been damaged. They had simply been managed with methods calibrated for something slightly different than they were. They would have run adequately for years. Adequately is its own kind of cost, paid slowly and invisibly. Russell told Earl this later during one of the follow-up calls that became a regular thing over the next year and a half. He said that what struck him most was not the specific corrections, but the existence of the ledgers themselves. That a man he had never heard of, working in a hardware store in a county 2 hours from where Russell had grown up, had been solving problems on his bench in the 1970s that Russell was still encountering in 2010 with no documented solution available to him. The knowledge had been there. It had always been there. It had simply never been connected to the people who needed it, because the system by which knowledge gets published and distributed and taught is not designed to find it where it actually lives, which is in the heads and notebooks of working people who do not consider themselves the kind of people who publish things. Gerald's daughter, a woman named Karen who had grown up watching her grandfather at work at that bench in the hardware store, and who had moved to Lexington in 2005 to work in a library, came home to Harlan County in the fall of 2012 to help her father with what the Toolbox had become. She had a degree in archival studies, and she had practical skills her grandfather would have recognized as his own kind. She spent 6 months with the 14 ledgers, producing a clean transcription and an indexed version that could be duplicated and distributed. She was the one who found, in the 9th ledger, a page Olin had written in 1978 that was not about any specific movement or repair problem. It was a short paragraph about what he thought watchmaking was. He had written that a watch movement was a collaboration across time, that the man who designed it, the man who machined it, and the man who serviced it 3 times across a century were all working on the same problem together, with different information and different tools and different limitations, but toward the same outcome, that the thing should keep running. He had written that he considered himself the least of the 3 because he was working with what the other 2 had already built, and his job was only to understand their decisions well enough not to ruin them. Karen found that page on a Tuesday in November and called her father. Gerald drove to Lexington and read it standing up in the kitchen of her apartment, in his coat, with his car keys still in his hand. He called Earl that evening. What came out of those calls over the following winter was a structure. The Pruitt Toolbox and the 14 ledger books were donated to the Kentucky Heritage Museum of Crafts in Berea, where Dr. Reyes had arranged for them to be cataloged as a formal collection. Carol Denby's assessment was updated and filed with the donation paperwork. The museum created a display that opened in 2014, modest and specific, about regional watchmaking practice in the mid-century Appalachian coalfields. Dr. Reyes wrote the interpretive text. She quoted Olin's 1978 paragraph. She did not shorten it. Earl Mott retired from the shop on Vine Street in 2015 at 67, with his knees causing him the same trouble Olin's knees had caused Olin at the end. He had spent 4 of his last 6 working years referencing Olin Pruitt's methods regularly in his own practice on movements that came to him from collectors across the state. He had attributed that work every time he mentioned it to anyone, in the way that careful people always attribute borrowed knowledge, not from obligation, but from accuracy, because they know that the map and the territory are 2 different things, and the person who drew the map deserves to be named. He had trained 2 apprentices in his last years on the bench, a man named Stanton, who had come to him in 2010 with a degree in mechanical engineering and a curiosity about small mechanisms, and a woman named Ruth, who had been repairing antique clocks since her 20s and wanted to extend her skills into pocket watches. He had taught them both through the Pruitt ledgers as a primary text alongside the standard reference volumes, not because the ledgers replaced the literature, but because they filled in what the literature could not cover, the place-specific, movement-specific, decade-specific finding that only comes from sitting at one bench long enough to see the same failure return 3 times and finally understand why. Both Stanton and Ruth knew Olin Pruitt's name before they knew most other names in the field. Stanton opened a shop in Winchester in 2017. Ruth took over Earl's space on Vine Street. She hung Earl's sign and put her name below it. She wrote to Earl when she opened, thanking him. He wrote back from his porch in Lexington, where he had been sitting most mornings since retiring, with a coffee and a newspaper and a view of the street below. He told her that the copied ledger pages were on the bottom shelf of the back bench, that she should read through the section on the 1930s Illinois movements when she had time, and that if anything came through her door that she could not place, Olin Pruitt had probably seen it. She replied that she had already found the ledgers. She had started with the 1978 paragraph. Let me tell you what those 14 books actually represented, because the number says only part of it. $67,000 is what a specialist, appraiser, assigned to the physical objects and the documented knowledge, using the methodology she had developed across 22 years of valuing such things. It is the number that exists in the record. It is accurate in the way formal assessments are accurate, which is to say it is precise and partial and correct within its own terms. What Dennis Vance had appraised at $400 was the same material. He had not been careless. He had been looking at it with the only tools he had, which were the tools that allowed him to recognize what things looked like when they were worth $400, and those tools had been sufficient for every other thing he had ever appraised. The Pruitt toolbox did not look like knowledge. It looked like equipment. The distinction between those two things is the entire argument. This is what the two kinds of knowing always come down to. There is a kind of knowledge that works through categories. This object belongs to this class of things. This class carries this range of values. The assessment is complete. It is efficient knowledge. It covers enormous territory quickly. It is nearly always right because nearly all things belong to categories that behave as expected. But it fails at exactly the point where the object in front of it has been shaped by a process that the category cannot account for. 40 years of patient attention to a specific bench, a specific set of problems, a specific regional condition, documented in a system so personal and particular that it looks, from the outside, like old accounting records. The other kind of knowledge moves slowly and handles one thing at a time. Earl Mott, sitting at that kitchen table for 4 hours. The 14 months of evening work. The careful reading that went slowly because the text kept diverging from the expected. It is not efficient. It cannot cover territory quickly. But it is the only instrument that can locate what is actually there, when what is actually there is not what it appears to be. Olin Pruitt had spent 42 years developing knowledge that no training program could have given him, because no training program ran for 42 years in Harlan County, Kentucky, on the specific movements that came in from the specific population of miners and merchants and farmers who needed their watches fixed. He learned what he learned because he stayed. He stayed because he was the kind of man who stayed. He wrote it down because he did not trust his own memory, which turns out to have been the one act of humility that made the whole thing survive him. Dr. Reyes said something to Gerald at the museum opening in 2014 that he repeated to Earl and that Earl told to Stanton and Ruth, and that Ruth wrote on a slip of paper she kept under the glass of her workbench on Vine Street. She said that the history of any craft, at its deepest level, is not the history of famous makers or published methods. It is the history of every working practitioner who ever sat down and paid attention and wrote down what they found. Most of those records vanish. The people who kept them did not consider themselves important enough to preserve. What survives usually survives by accident, or by the intervention of someone who knew enough to recognize what they were looking at before someone else put it in an auction lot. Gerald Pruitt had been lucky. He had called the right person. The dented metal toolbox, baling wire loop still holding the broken latch, sits in a climate-controlled case in the museum in Berea. The 14 ledger books sit in archival sleeves beside it. The staking set rests in its green felt tray and catches the light at a particular angle in the afternoon, the way fine old steel does when it has been kept clean. Olin Pruitt's bench lasted 42 years in a county most people drove through without stopping. And everything he learned there is still there, still intact, in a room where the temperature is kept constant, and anyone who knows enough to ask can sit down and read what he found. That is what a body of knowledge actually weighs, not what it sells for on a Saturday morning, what it costs to replace,